A burst from a German MG-42 shatters US Sergeant Sylvester Antolak's right arm. He jams his Tommy gun under the broken limb and keeps firing left-handed, charging alone across open ground toward the nest that's pinning his entire platoon in the dirt. May 24th, 1944. The only road off the Anzio beachhead for 150,000 trapped Allied soldiers runs straight through this position outside Cisterna, Italy. 770 hand-picked US Army Rangers had already attempted a night infiltration of the town. 6 came back. But now, German prisoners would later say they'd never seen anything like what this one single man was about to do next. Sylvester Antolak didn't grow up with comfort. He did so in a crowded Polish-American farmhouse in Ohio as one of 11 children, where no one could afford to fall behind. Farm life taught him that a family only gets through a rough season if everyone pulls together, and that if one person falls behind, somebody else needs to stand up and grab the load. With that in mind, Antolak didn't wait for war to become unavoidable. He enlisted in July 1941, several months before Pearl Harbor, hoping that when the fight finally came, he'd be trained and already in a unit. By the time he shipped out, he belonged to the 15th Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, a unit that kept getting thrown into the thickest fighting. Their first major combat job came in North Africa in late 1942. It was the one place the Allies could put American ground troops ashore in strength and go at German-led forces without trying to crack Europe head-on. The operation had major strategic aims, such as clearing the Axis from Africa and securing the Mediterranean routes. But for Antolak and the men beside him, it was their trial by fire. Antolak's battalion went in near Fadala, outside Casablanca, on November 8th. The surf was rough on their approach, making the units arrive scattered. The men hit the sand, wet and overloaded by the noise and confusion. Some drowned before they ever reached land. Others were hit as they fought their way off the waterline. But they still had to move inland. Their job was to clear room for the rest of the division before the beach was clogged with men and equipment. If they failed, then the entire shore would become a death trap. Antolak yanked his men down behind a rise, spotted the muzzle flashes, and waved them forward in bursts. He advanced in short rushes, stopping only long enough to get bearings, then shifted ahead once again. By early morning, American units had taken Fadala, capturing enemy troops in the town as the operation accelerated. Since the landings had held, the beachhead had a chance to expand, and the push toward Casablanca continued. As a result of their success, by summer 1943, the Army relied heavily on Antolak's regiment to keep driving the front line. In July, he went across the water into Sicily as part of the push to tear the island out of Axis control. His regiment came ashore near Licata and drove inland at once, crossing farmland broken by low stone walls and shallow drainage cuts. Every field and wall felt like an ambush waiting to happen. This was the rhythm of the island. Most fights in Sicily collapsed into short-range combat. German and Italian defenders weren't lined up in neat trenches. They were tucked into farm compounds, behind road bends, and along the edges of towns, waiting for the first squad to commit. Antolak learned fast what hesitation did to a squad. He saw firsthand men freeze for a second, either looking for a better route or waiting for someone else to move fast, and watched them get punished for stalling. So he started making decisions that kept the squad moving as one. On a battlefield, no one had the luxury of waiting for perfect cover. When firing pinned him or his men in the open, the answer was to force the enemy down, then move. They needed to close the distance before a gun team could settle in and start cutting the line apart. Soon, he relied on speed and pressure more and more. He knew the longer he searched for a safe route, the more time he gave the enemy to settle their aim and start cutting the squad down. When a man lagged, Antolak went to him. Sometimes that meant grabbing a strap of webbing or a sleeve and yanking him forward through the opening before enemy fire could settle and lock the ground down again. He simply refused to let his people be stranded. Day by day, Antolak's outfit worked inland and north toward the roads that tied the island together, pushing through farm country and into the approaches to Palermo, one of the key prizes that fell in late July. Then he was sent to Salerno in September. His division went ashore into a beachhead already under heavy counterattack. German tanks, artillery, and infantry drove toward the shore, trying to shove the Allies back into the sea. There was no clean front line yet, only scattered pockets of Americans holding dunes, olive groves, and the first terraced rises inland. Positions held at dawn could be under assault again by noon. German armor hit hard enough that the Allies came close to being forced back into the water. The crisis peaked around September 13th, when German attacks threatened to split the perimeter. But neither Antolak nor his men broke. They absorbed the counterattack and focused on stabilizing the line while keeping enough combat power on shore to prevent a collapse. In the groves, the infantry dug in and waited for armor to return. As artillery and tanks hammered the approaches, they then shifted fast whenever the line bent. Naval gunfire helped blunt the counterattacks until the pressure finally eased. It was ugly. Antolak watched comrades go down around him, but the Germans eventually pulled back. In the end, the Allied foothold strengthened, and the campaign moved inland. By the time the regiment reached Anzio, Antolak was already a sergeant and squad leader in Company B, accustomed to making quick calls amid the confusion and incoming fire of an active battlefield. On January 22, 1944, he came ashore in the first wave of Operation Shingle. He was only 26 years old. The opening days were fast and uncertain as the 15th Infantry secured the beach, then pushed inland into flat farmland, where canals and drainage cuts left troops exposed, and German gunners could see and hit almost anything that moved. Patrols felt their way toward rail lines and road junctions, while rifle companies dug in on whatever small rises they could find. The idea was to reach Cisterna and the Alban Hills quickly enough to knock the German defense off balance. That chance closed almost immediately when German reinforcements flooded in. The beachhead that was supposed to expand instead tightened into a cramped perimeter of trenches and wrecked farm ground, where Antolak and his squad dug in, got hit, patched themselves back together, and waited for the next push. The worst strain came in mid-February. On the 16th, the Germans launched Operation Fischfang, driving down the Anzio road with infantry and armor, including Tiger tanks, in waves meant to split the beachhead and shove it back into the sea. Tanks moved in the dark. Tracers skimmed low across soaked fields, and squads fought from one fold in the ground to the next. The Allied line bent, but didn't break, as every gap was plugged before it could widen. Between bombardments, Antolak himself was leading small patrols and raids to probe the line, lunging for a ditch, a farmhouse, or a hedgerow, then digging in to hold it against the next hit. He also took part in short pushes to straighten the line and pulled his squad back together after each shelling. Even after Fischfang stalled, the pressure stayed. In late February and early March, more German attacks hit near the Cisterna sector, amounting to more losses, but no collapse. The enemy wasn't just containing the landing, they were trying to crush it. By the spring of 1944, the Anzio landing had turned into a lethal siege. Rain turned foxholes and trenches into pools of water, forcing men to stand for hours or try to sleep while soaked. In daylight, they kept their heads down, watched the horizon, and waited for the next burst of fire. Nights were short stretches of rest, broken by shelling, flares, and patrols. Antolak was exhausted, and yet he never showed it to his men, even if he'd been on that beachhead for weeks, living in mud that never really dried, and under fire that rarely let up. Every push at Anzio was tied to something larger than that strip of coast, even if Antolak only ever saw it as the next field or the next line of fire. The campaign in Italy was the road to Rome, and in its own slow way, a pressure point on Germany, while bigger plans were being built elsewhere. When the Italian government surrendered, the fighting didn't stop. German forces moved in fast, took over the prepared defenses, and dug into the mountains. The country became another hard front that had to be fought through, step by step, ridge by ridge, town by town. If Italy cracked, Germany would have to bleed troops here, the same troops that were currently shooting at Antolak. It would also keep German units under constant strain while the main invasion of France was still being built. Holding the peninsula also meant controlling the Mediterranean routes needed for ships, fuel, and supplies. With southern airfields in Allied hands, bombers could reach deeper into Germany, Austria, and the Balkans. In early 1944, though, Rome was still just beyond reach. South of the city, the Gustav Line held firm, dug into heights and ridges designed to slow any advance. Monte Cassino became the symbol of that stand, the place where repeated attacks, heavy losses, and stalled progress all met. Anzio was supposed to break that impasse. Operation Shingle put troops ashore behind the Gustav Line to force the Germans to pull back. Instead, German units reacted quickly, and within days, the beachhead was boxed in and under steady fire, its flat approaches watched by artillery and machine guns. By May, the plan was finally ready to move again. The main assault on the Gustav Line began on the 11th, while the breakout from Anzio was set for late May. For the plan to work, Antolak's regiment had to take key ground. The Germans treated Cisterna as a hinge for the whole perimeter. 4 months earlier, American Rangers had tried to seize Cisterna in a night attack and were caught in a trap. By dawn, the force was shattered, with hundreds lost and most of the survivors taken prisoner. Antolak had heard that story, just like everyone on the beachhead. So when the order came down for him to move on to that same town, he didn't need a briefing to understand what they were walking into. May 23, 1944 opened with a sound that men at Anzio had waited months to hear: a wall of guns. At 5:45 a.m., about 1,500 Allied guns opened together in a single rolling barrage. The ground around Antolak's position shook as if the earth were bucking under him. For 40 minutes, the bombardment pounded the German line near Cisterna until the air smelled of hot metal and torn soil. The guns paused long enough for aircraft to strike the same targets. After the planes passed, the artillery moved in closer, advancing in short lifts. The shells kept falling, so the infantry could move up behind the bombardment. All of it signaled that the breakout from Anzio had finally begun. Antolak's platoon moved with the forward edge of the 15th Infantry, pushing out of the siege works and into farmland that had been nearly impossible to cross in daylight for months. German defenses were built for this moment, with machine gun positions tied into old farm buildings and trenches dug deep. The fields were already laid out for interlocking fire. Still, the Allied bombardment was meant to rip gaps in that system, faster than the defenders could seal them. The first day was slow, filled with short rushes forward. Antolak kept dragging the line forward, 10 yards at a time, every time the fire lifted. Rifle companies followed, dropping into ditches, cutting wire, and crossing ground still smoking from the shells. Antolak kept focused, watching the barrage lift. He counted heads whenever the line halted. He checked ammunition. He pointed his squad toward the next scrap of cover and kept them from bunching up in the open as rounds snapped overhead and shells walked the fields. Every few hundred yards, the line snagged on another gun position that had survived. Those fights happened low to the dirt, with grenades tossed into dugouts, and men dragging each other into shallow cover between bursts. Antolak's world then narrowed down to the next ditch, the next wall, anything that would allow him to keep his men safe. Only then did he figure out the next short move. The fighting proved the Germans were still hitting back. The US 1st Armored Division lost around 100 tanks. The 3rd Infantry Division suffered close to 1,000 casualties. German losses were heavy as well. Units like the 362nd Infantry Division were judged to be reduced to roughly half strength. And still, the enemy response on the ground was immediate. As the day dragged on, the machine gun fire intensified, and Antolak felt the corridor narrowing under them. Higher up, the German command was trying to guess where the real break would land, so they could throw the reserves into the right corridor. General von Mackensen kept expecting the main Allied push to come up the Via Anziate, a view the British attacks there seemed to support. Kesselring, meanwhile, watched Route 6 in Cisterna's flank and pulled the Hermann Göring Panzer Division out of reserve near Livorno to block the road at Valmatone and protect the 10th Army's route back from Cassino. And yet, both sides were converging on the same choke point, the approaches to Cisterna. By nightfall, they were up to the railroad embankment outside Cisterna. After a full day of fighting, they were tired and short on sleep. The railroad embankment was behind them. Ahead lay flat farmland with only shallow dips and broken weeds for cover. Every man in the line knew what that meant. In daylight, this close to Cisterna, ground like that was something the Germans had already measured, watched, and prepared to fire across. First, they had to cut the rail line south of town. The Germans had dug in on both sides, and the track bed ran in a deep cut, like a trench wide enough to swallow a platoon. Crossing meant sliding down one bank, sprinting over the rails, then clawing up the far side before the guns found them. Men gathered behind a high stone wall to study the ground and line up the platoons. From there, the cut looked like a chute straight into fire. Off to the right, near a concrete culvert, 2 machine guns were set to cover the crossing. Their fields of fire overlapped so neatly that anyone caught in the cut would be hit from both angles, once the triggers were pulled. A man in Antolak's company tried to silence them with a Browning automatic rifle, leaning into the wall and hosing the positions in short bursts. Tracers sparked off the shielding, but the guns stayed up. Seconds slid by while everyone understood there was no safe way through, only a fast one. They moved anyway, spreading out as best they could, using faint folds in the earth, stepping over old furrows and drainage cuts left from farming seasons years back. For a few minutes, the only sounds were boots in the dirt and gear shifting, a tight quiet that almost made it seem they might cross before the firing started. The first platoon dropped into the cut. No gunfire yet. The second followed. Still nothing. Men crossed one at a time. Antolak's line feeding into the ditch and over the rails. One soldier hit the track bed, bounded across, and reached the far bank, with rounds already snapping past him. At the top, he tossed a quick gesture back toward the wall, then flattened out and crawled on. Then the guns opened. The trap snapped shut. Heavy machine guns opened from more than one direction, overlapping fire that swept the railroad cut like a net. One stream tore low through the grass. Another crossed in from the right, slicing the lane. Rifles and machine pistols joined in, the sharp cracks riding on the heavier hammering. None of it was random. The Germans had let the lead element slip into the cut, waited until the crossing filled, then opened everything at once. A corporal paused in the track bed for half a second and paid for it. He dropped on the rails under the first burst, and the rest of the line hit the dirt. Wherever there was a fold, a rock, or a rail tie to hide behind. Men tried to claw up the far banks, boots sliding on loose soil, while rounds snapped into stone around them. One soldier got hung up halfway down when his entrenching tool jammed between two rocks. Someone behind him started to rise to help, then flattened out at a shouted warning. The only way out was ahead, and the ground ahead was covered. When the platoon finally dragged itself over the far side, there still wasn't real shelter, just a low rock wall to collapse behind. Fire kept probing even there. A machine gun raked the edge. A sniper round smacked at a helmet hard enough to spin it, and another shot splintered a rifle stock. Beyond that wall, two strongpoints sat. One kept pouring fire into the men who had crossed first, trying to drive a wedge between the front groups, and everyone was still pinned behind the cut. The platoon was being split in plain sight. Antolak, about 30 yards in front of his own squad, saw it. If the lead groups were cut off, they would be swallowed first, and the rest would follow in pieces. There was no time to wait for a new order. Staying down meant being taken apart. He made the only decision that could change the field and save his men. He went straight at the guns. He rose into full view and ran across roughly 200 yards of flat, open ground toward the first machine gun nest. Fire snapped at him from several angles. Early in the sprint, a round hit high in his shoulder and shattered his right arm, dropping it limp against his side. Antolak kept moving, wedging his weapon under that useless arm and firing with his left hand whenever the muzzle flashes lined up. A second round slammed into his torso and threw him hard to the ground. He stayed down only a beat, then forced himself upright and drove forward again. A third hit tore into his leg and dropped him once more. Men behind him watched him rise after each impact, moving in short, stubborn surges, down, up, forward, firing when he could, closing the distance a few yards at a time, while the guns kept raking the field. After the third shot, he hit the ground hard one last time, dust kicking up around his chest, then forced himself upright again. When he came up, the platoon saw the damage clearly. His right arm hung at a bad angle, the shoulder punched clean through, the sleeve already dark and heavy. Antolak didn't even try to use it. He jammed the stock of his submachine gun tight under that broken arm like a clamp, pinned the weapon against his ribs, and kept the barrel pointed forward. With his left hand, he fired in short, steady bursts as he staggered on, half running, half lurching, refusing to give the gunner a clean pause to reset. The first German nest saw one man still coming after all that, and cracked. 10 soldiers threw down their weapons and shouted surrender. But the fight wasn't finished. The second strongpoint, farther ahead, was still stitching the dirt and holding the platoon in place. Antolak's squad was shouting for him to get down, calling for medics, for smoke, anything to pull him out of that lane. He didn't listen. If that second gun stayed alive, the platoon stayed split and pinned. so he turned toward the next muzzle flashes and kept going. He didn't have much left to go on. One arm was already useless. His body had been hit more than once. Still, he forced himself forward in short, grinding drives. Each time he reeled, he caught himself and pushed again. By sheer will, he covered another 60 yards under that fire, staggered, regained his feet, and tottered forward a few more yards until a final concentration of rounds stopped him for good. From behind, his men watched in real time. The feeling of being trapped broke. Anger and momentum took their place. Squads that had been welded to the dirt a moment earlier rose and rushed, storming the second emplacement while the enemy was still shaken. The position that had been cutting them apart was overrun in the wake of his charge, and the machine gun had been captured. As a direct result of his actions, 20 Germans were taken out of the fight, and the path for his company to advance was cleared. When his men circled back, Antolak was lying where he'd fallen. The last yards had taken everything, including his life. However, the gap he'd ripped open stayed open. His platoon flowed through it, carried the line forward, and finished the push towards Cisterna. His final run flipped the fight, and the breakout got the foothold it needed. When the firing finally eased at Cisterna, the army had one clear way to mark what had happened on that field: the Medal of Honor. News of his sacrifice reached home first. When the army officer came to the farm, his mother, Mary, didn't speak English. She had to walk out into the fields and bring her sons in so someone could interpret what the men in uniform were trying to say. A military vehicle returned for the ceremony, taking Mary and her children, Anne and Alec, from the farm to Fort Hayes in Columbus. There, Major General James Collins placed the medal around her neck. In the 3rd Infantry Division, his story spread as an example of what was expected of every single one of them. Even some German prisoners later said they'd never seen anything like one wounded Anzio still coming forward, despite hit after hit.